Traditionally, readers of Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca have viewed the character Rebecca as the primary source of mystery. Throughout the novel, the narrator is constantly asking herself, who was Rebecca, the first Miss de Winter, her current husband, Maxim's first wife, who drowned a year before she married Maxim? The narrator's constantly speculating who this woman is, what was she like? And of course, the narrator, given her very poor self esteem, is always assuming that Rebecca, in any situation, was witty and charming and beautiful and eminently attractive. Of course, as the plot unfolds, we find out more and more about Rebecca, and indeed more and more about Rebecca's relationship with Maxim, and then the mystery deepens. The mystery becomes less about who Rebecca was and more about how did Rebecca die. But interestingly, the narrator herself comes across as quite mysterious, and in fact is perhaps more mysterious than Rebecca, and perhaps does not give us her name not so much out of a desire to efface herself, but out of a desire to remain enigmatic. As Rebecca, the character becomes increasingly clear to us, the narrator remains ambiguous. Let's think about this narrator. Uh, so, on the surface, it seems that she is quite legible. She is, of course, a woman much younger than Maxim, a woman who was working for an older American socialite as a sort of maid slash secretary slash gopher. Her family is all gone, we learn. We learn that she was very close to her father. But we learn little else. We don't know where she grew up. We don't know where she went to school. We don't really know what her likes and dislikes were. We don't know what kind of friends she had, if she had any friends at all. As the narrator, she chooses to tell us very little about herself. But we do know her certainly through the qualities that she exhibits through most of the story. She is constantly demeaning herself. She is insecure. She is inexperienced, and she's highly aware of her insecurity and inexperience. At one point, she says, I'm behaving like I'm someone who is neurotic. And indeed, she does seem to doubt herself at every turn. She seems to compare herself unfavorably to Rebecca at almost every turn. And whenever she's in a conversation with someone, she tends to assume that that person is thinking of her, what she thinks of herself, meaning she assumes that person is thinking of her in a negative way. However, we do gain some, let's call it, objective knowledge of our narrator from Frank Crawley, the assistant to Maxim de Winter. Frank says to her, yes, Rebecca might have been witty and charming and beautiful, but maybe Maxim doesn't want that kind of woman now. Maybe he wants a woman like you who is modest and sincere. So clearly the narrator appears to Crawley in this positive way. I think we can believe his character. He's painted as a character who is discreet, but also a character who is honest. Well, we also see a positive side of the narrator in her initial reactions to Miss Danvers. When she learns that Miss Danvers adored Rebecca, she feels sympathy for Miss Danvers. She says, well, of course Miss Danvers doesn't like being around me because I remind her of Rebecca, the woman she loved, and a woman who is lost forever. So even if we don't know much about the narrator's background, we do know that the narrator is insecure. We do know that the narrator is capable of sympathy and generosity. We do know that the narrator presents herself to Crawley as modest and sincere. But beyond that, what do we know? There mysteries start to emerge. The first is this: why does she marry Max de Winter? She's half his age. She knows nothing about him other than that he owns Manderley, a beautiful country house, and that his wife died a year before. Other than that, she knows nothing about him. And he shows her very little romantic energy throughout the, say, week-long courtship in Monte Carlo, spent largely by the two of them driving around in Maxim's car and having lunch and dinner together. When he proposes to her, he says, "I'm asking you to marry me, you little fool." And he treats her as he would a child. Why did she marry him? Of course, when she finds her way to Manderley, the relationship is not romantic there either. Let's think about it. So when she starts falling in love, as she says, with Maxim, she uses language that would have been unorthodox at the time to talk about her affection for Maxim. Even though she imagines it as heterosexual romance, she says, he's like a brother to me. Well, that's odd. That suggests a kind of incestuous drive. She also says, he's like a father to me, also suggesting a kind of incestuous drive. At another point, she says, I'm like a young boy around him in school, and he's like an older boy or a young teacher on whom I have a crush. So she imagines her relationship to him in homoerotic terms. In 1938, this would have been seen as unorthodox in mainstream society. Now, we could pause here if we wanted to and talk about Daphne du Maurier's own sexuality, which is what we would now call non-binary. She herself admitted to having a very strong masculine side. She created a kind of masculine persona. At one point, she named this persona Eric Avon. And she also said, I have a fairly well-defined feminine persona. But I won't go into that now because we're focusing more on the novel. So the narrator's desire to marry Maxim, given how she defines her relationship to him, incestuously or homoerotically, is odd. Again, it's sorry, my cat is jumping. Why does she say so little about her past? She never tells us anything about herself, really, before she is with Maxim. Why does she not tell us as readers or tell characters around her more about her family? We know nothing about her father other than the fact that she was very close with him. Why does she tell us about her father, her mother? Again, we know nothing about any of her friends. Why does she choose to keep that information from us? That's also enigmatic. But I would say that the oddest part of this narrator's persona is, given her constant harping on her own insecurity, on her own inabilities, on her own inexperience, given her constant imagining of herself as weak and inept. Given these things, it's odd that she shows some strangely violent tendencies. What does that mean? Maxim gives her a book of poems, Francis Thompson, famous for the poem Hound of Heaven. And she sees in the book, on the title page, an inscription from Rebecca to Maxim. She refers to him as Max. She calls him Maxim. And after Maxim has asked her to marry him, very soon after that, she's looking at the book and she thinks, I don't want this first page in the book at all anymore. So she rips it out, even though this is not her book. It's Maxim's book. And for all she knows, a very important book to him. She rips the page out and burns it right there in a hotel room in Monte Carlo. Now, this is very strong foreshadowing, as those of you who have read the full novel know. But why would she do this? This seems to be a kind of extreme and violent act for someone who paints herself as so weak and passive and milksoppy. Well, there's another scene later on when she is in Manderley and she's talking to Frank Crawley again, the assistant, or I guess I should say it's almost like the real estate. He's the agent of Maximum, someone who helps him manage the property would be a way to talk about Frank Crawley. And she starts asking Frank about Rebecca's death. And clearly Frank Crawley is very uncomfortable talking about this. And the narrator takes a kind of perverse pleasure in pushing him deeper and deeper and deeper into the unseemly details of the death. How did she die? She drowned. When did this occur? At night. How did it occur? She was sailing, her boat capsized, and she had to swim back to shore, and she drowned. Well, when did her body appear? Oh, 2 months later. How do you know it was hers? Well, Maxim had to identify it. And you can imagine what a body would look like after 2 months in the sea. So she keeps pushing, almost with a morbid curiosity, or we might say a perverse desire to know the goriest details of the story, in a way that pushes against propriety, certainly, but one might even say transgresses propriety. Again, it's another urge that suggests a kind of violence in her, a desire to be close to gory details, death, destruction. And then, of course, there's the scene where she accidentally breaks the very valuable Cupid figurine in the morning room that Rebecca used to inhabit, that Rebecca decorated entirely. The narrator receives a collection of art books from Beatrice, the sister of Maxim. She sketches. That's all she can do. Rebecca could do everything. She could sail, she could ride, she could shoot, she could do everything. So the little talent, we might say, of the narrator, she places these books on the desk in a precarious way, and they fall and they knock the Cupid over and destroy it. Very valuable Cupid figure. And then she tries to hide the fragments behind some books. Now, again, we are told that this is an accident, and perhaps it was an accident. But we don't need Dr. Freud around to tell us that certainly the narrator wants to destroy Rebecca's things. She wants Rebecca's strength to be diminished. She feels haunted by Rebecca. She feels as if Rebecca has taken her over. So one way, perhaps, to diminish the power of Rebecca would be to destroy some of her things. Why not the most valuable thing? So it's just interesting as we go through the novel again to think of the narrator perhaps as not quite reliable. She seems to want overtly to present to us a certain kind of character. I'm weak, I'm inexperienced, I'm insecure, etc. But there are moments in the novel throughout where she expresses a darker, more violent side of herself. And when we connect this to the enigmas of her past and to the enigmas of her sexual attraction to Maxim, she becomes quite a complicated and strange figure. And we start wondering, is it she who is the most enigmatic figure in the novel and not Rebecca? And indeed, in writing the novel, the narrator, about Rebecca, is she trying to divert attention from her darker impulses to Rebecca?